David Barsamian joins us now in the studio. Good morning, David.
Good morning, Sam, and we're pleased to welcome Ward Churchill to KGNU, Professor of Indian Studies at the University of Colorado at Boulder, former chair of the Ethnic Studies Department, winner of numerous awards, including the University President's Service Award, the Thomas Jefferson Award, the Arts and Faculty Excellence in Teaching Award. He's the author of numerous books, including A Little Matter of Genocide, the classic book with Jim Vanderwall, Agents of Repression, and on the justice of roosting chickens. Welcome to the program, Ward Churchill.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And I should mention, just for full disclosure, that I have been working with Ward Churchill and have featured him on my own nationally syndicated program, Alternative Radio, for a number of years. Well, Ward Churchill, you are a lightning rod for criticism, for attention, but it's interesting, I think, chronologically, that the focus of the vitriol that you've been subjected to, and I do choose that word carefully, really started in the winter of 2005, some 4 years after you wrote an essay on the internet, which was later revised and given extensive footnotes on the justice of roosting chickens, and with the phrase "little Eichmanns," which you apparently cited from John Zerzan. Why then, in January, February of 2005, did this hit the fan?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think there's probably a confluence of factors, local, national, even international, that are involved in that. This is part of a broader campaign that's been undertaken by ACTA, Len Chaney's group, which intends to take any divergent opinion out of the academy, converting the academy into an ideological rubber stamp of the status quo. Governor of this state happens to have been, and still is, as far as I know, a board member of ACTA, David Horowitz's campaign, which interfaces with ADSCAPE, Mellon funding, and all the rest of this sort of drive to sanitize, sterilize, and constrain the nature of critical discourse in this country. I was a useful target in that sense. The local hook, in part, had to do with the inability of the prosecutors, the city of Denver, to obtain convictions against the leadership of the Columbus Day protests. In the, October of 2004, that framing, we had a press conference to articulate our impressions of the implications of that on Tuesday, and on Wednesday, the furor over the roosting chickens piece erupted. Bill O'Reilly then ran 41 consecutive nights with segments. Sean Hannity weighed in. Joe Scarborough weighed in. The governor called for my firing. The governor of New York, George Pataki, called for my firing. The legislature of Wisconsin demanded I be excluded from academic fora there. The legislature of the state of Washington did the same. The administration of the University of Colorado at Boulder tried to prohibit me from speaking on campus, and so on, so on, and so on. Now, you've got an interesting sort of dynamic at work there. You've got the attack dogs of the right making this a highly visible public issue. And interestingly enough, you've got self-styled liberal academics doing the enforcement. Run for cover is not exactly sufficient explanation of what it was that liberal administrators did. They actively implemented the right-wing agenda in order to presumably cut their losses, would be their rationalization. But basically they're scuttling, sacrificing the whole mission of the institution unless you buy in to the Cheney-Horowitz paradigm.
I was looking at the University of Colorado website, and I'm quoting here, in the year before the controversy erupted, I'm quoting, in 2004, Ward Churchill taught a higher number of courses than required, received A's and A pluses on his student evaluations, completed numerous publications, and served as administrative chair of the department. But by March 29th, just of the next year, 2005, the Standing Committee on Research Misconduct received a complaint that Professor Ward Churchill had committed research misconduct through falsification of information, fabrication of information, plagiarism, and improper authorship practices. My first question is, who filed the complaint?
The university. There were, so far as I've been able to ascertain, no complaints lodged with the university. The university, under this rubric, which is in fact, a categorical violations of the rules of the Regents, took me under investigation for the content of my speech, both speech as verbally articulated and speech in terms of everything I'd ever written, and that's a quote. Logically, they were going to conclude on the basis of that investigation that they had no cause of action against me because speech is protected. But in the interim, while they were buying time, they were actively soliciting complaints or framing non-complaints into complaints. And along the line, since they like to talk about my misuse or distortion of sources, utilized a faculty member in the law school, Paul Campos, through his column in the Rocky Mountain News to absolutely distort one of the supposed complainants, which is John Lavelle. That's the origin of the allegation of plagiarism with regard to Rebecca Robbins' piece and so on. Now, what Campos said in his column was that Lavelle accused me of plagiarism. Lavelle had not. Lavelle said, I probably wrote the piece with Robbins' name on it, which turns out to be true. That's now confirmed by the investigating committee, but that absolute inversion of what the source said in the most public possible local arena doesn't constitute a distortion, misuse of sources, or academic misconduct on Professor Campos' part. So you've got this illusion that's been created that people were rushing in to file complaints on me. Well, the actuality was that the university was going out trying to find some and creating them where they didn't exist. And on the other hand, you have an exemption from these lofty standards to which I'm to be held, quite falsely, of people who were actually doing it like Campos.
I mean, do you feel you've been unfairly singled out?
Well, certainly, but that's part of the turf here. So there's an explanatory aspect of it, a clarifying aspect of how this process and this rhetoric about academic freedom and academic standards and academic integrity and academic hoo-ha actually work.
Arundhati Roy of India, who's a very outspoken advocate for indigenous rights in that country, has said of the situation in India, maybe it's analogous to here, that it's a dangerous time to be a tall poppy.
Sure, well put. I happen to be being visited by a Maori friend, Moana Jackson, who is one of the preeminent legal scholars from the Maori position in New Zealand. He was visiting at the time that these investigative committees, baloney, to quote myself from commentary to AP, was released. He skimmed the report and looked up and said, this is exactly what they're doing to indigenous scholars in New Zealand. And I've heard that from several quarters as the report gets out and gets digested. See, I write 2 paragraphs making a general assertion, a summary statement of the implications of a particular piece of legislation or a particular historical event. With regard to that 2 paragraphs, they write 40 pages of dense prose to hide the fact that they are unable to find academic misconduct there. And it really takes a while for people to unpack that reality. But as that begins to become unpacked, I continue to get more of that kind of commentary. And that kind of commentary is going out on the blogosphere and so forth, not from me, but from others who understand the implications of it with increasing frequency now. So I think the hole that this so-called objective committee dug for itself in this so-called due process that's been received through the university, the hole that's been dug is getting increasingly deep. Now, so you talk about a self-discrediting institutional procedure. This would be kind of the epitome.
And let me just separate those 2 committees. There was an investigative committee that then forwarded its conclusions to the Standing Committee on Research Misconduct, which I'll refer to as SCRM. So SCRM, I'm quoting, has accepted the conclusions of the investigative committee that Professor Ward Churchill has committed serious, repeated, and deliberate research misconduct. They continue, the Standing Committee did not reach or seek consensus with regard to disciplinary actions. There have been various things proposed. 6 of the voting members recommended dismissal from the university. 3 members recommended suspension without pay. 2 of these recommended suspension without pay for 5 years, and 1 recommended suspension for 2 years. In the Churchill case, SCRM, I'm quoting again.
It's usually referred to as the scrum.
Scrum shares the concerns expressed by the investigative committee regarding the timing and context in which the allegations against Professor Churchill were raised. Then they continue. However, at each stage of the process, the Scrum was careful to restrict its review to the allegations of research misconduct without consideration of issues that received widespread attention by others interested in Professor Churchill's work. In particular, the Scrum's deliberations were devoid of any discussions of Professor Churchill's 9/11 essay or of issues of academic free speech in general. In regard to that last sentence, would you accept that as accurate?
Well, if I believed in the tooth fairy, the idea that a faculty committee under the conditions that have been imposed could in any sense exist in a bubble divorced from the fact that they don't mention it in the documents, a rather easily accomplished fact. The context and the environment speak for themselves. All they've done there is express a high degree of duplicity and mendacity. Own it, guys. You couldn't possibly be divorced from all of this. And the pretense that you were reduces the rest of your charade to proper standing. The Scrum was agreeing with the outcome of this investigative report before the investigative committee was ever formed. They went through the procedure to put a facade of legitimacy on an utterly illegitimate process. And the process was illegitimate the moment the interim chancellor formed an ad hoc committee in contravention of the rules of the Regents under the First Amendment of the United States to investigate my speech. And then we have the charade that we're talking about where you have the presentation of people rushing up to make these other sorts of complaints when in fact the university is soliciting them. And in full knowledge of that, the Scrum accepts it, pronounces itself compelled, despite the breaches of rules that have already occurred, to treat these things as serious matters, and they're doing it again. It's been a charade from start to finish. Standing committee conducts an inquiry, finds a basis for fuller investigation, rigs a committee primarily internal to the university, and I said, this tainted jury pool. You cannot have 450 newspaper articles devoted mostly a front page kind of coverage over a 60-day period of time, threatening the very existence of the university, and have a neutral jury pool composed of the faculty within the institution, particularly from the School of Law, because you had the interim dean there as part of the ad hoc committee in full knowledge that it was an illegal activity, or at least an illegitimate activity. But if you take the rules of the Regents, or the laws of the Regents as they call it, as law, then it would have to be framed as illegal. You got that. You got speeches that were made about how I was compromising the ability of the law school to raise funds for its new building. You've got Campos doing the hatchet job propaganda-wise in the Rocky Mountain News. Particularly, you cannot find untainted members in the law school. And in the face of that, they say, well, we're not convinced, and make 3 out of 5 members of this investigating committee were drawn internally and chaired by a member of the law school faculty. All right? You have that charade, and then you have the acceptance formally with all due pontification, sanctimony, and so forth about how this is unique and anomalous and horrifying case put out for public consumption. All of that is to package something that was indefensible and create an appearance of defensibility, and that's going to backfire not only on the institution, but on the taxpayers of Colorado in the long run, because it's not sustainable in court, and that's true on a number of grounds.
Albert Ramirez is the chair of the Ethnic Studies Department, the department that you served also as chair. He wrote a letter to the University of Colorado saying that it has denied you a due process and has the university has refused to support his department from outside attacks. What is he talking about there? Have there been threats made to ethnic studies department?
Oh, continuously.
Individual professors?
Yeah, individual professors, notably myself, obviously, but also other professors that were seen.
In what form have these threats? Emails?
Well, try this. I can give you a few quotes that were not responded to in context by university administration. While they're talking the usual platitudes about combating racism, increasing diversity, the department is being inundated with emails of the sort, and this is the nature of the opposition here, which validates my point about Eichmann's, I would say. Hitler picked the wrong people. Should have exterminated the Indians beginning with your grandparents. Okay, Custer should have finished the job. Shivington should have finished the job. I can go on. All right? First time in my life I've ever been called a burrhead. Apparently somebody that just sees people of color as interchangeable parts, and any epithet will do. And so on that level, I got 8,000 emails, about two-thirds of which were of that temper, all right? Not all as eloquently put as that, but the general drift. And the really interesting thing was that they would revile Indians, in my case, for example, and then accuse me of not being one. All right? So they really say these ugly things about American Indians and then accuse me of being a fraud. And these are, one can presume, and they usually announce the fact pridefully, self-described Aryans or white people. And the worst thing a white guy who wants to insult you can think to call you as a white guy? I mean, there's a pathology embedded in this. There's loathing and self-concept that is being manifest towards others. That's the sorts of thing we were dealing with all spring. It ended up being, the department did pretty well, all things considered, but with absolutely no support, not even symbolic, from the administration. And that's the actual depth once you scratch the rhetoric of the concern and commitment to anything besides an institutional white studies edifice.
If you'd like to talk to Ward Churchill on KJNU, give us a call here on the studio line, 303-442-4242. That's 303-442-4242. Ward Churchill, you probably know I happen to be of Armenian background. I knew my parents. They told me they were Armenian. I believed them. I knew one of my grandparents. The other three were murdered by the Turks. But beyond that, I have very little information about my own heritage and ethnic background, and it's quite plausible that there may be Turkish or Arab or Kurdish or Iranian blood flowing through my veins. What about this whole issue of authenticity and who is an Armenian or who is a German or who is an Indian? What constitutes that blood quotient?
I don't know that it is a blood quotient. Traditionally, American Indians brought in people who were by blood, in no sense associated with them, function as nations naturalized citizens. You have naturalization by marriage, by adoption, by petition, by various means. Blood is a concept of a particular group, and it would be the settler society here, who then presumes, in defense of the integrity of native societies, to impose their definition of who it is that's entitled this week to be. As I say, they will revile you as an Indian, then announce that you're a fraud and that you're not. They're going to decide. And you have an example of that occurred in the, absolute Ku Klux Klan level racism, by definition. The source I was just getting ready to mention is in the Boulder Daily Camera in an op-ed piece over the weekend from a supposed progressive feminist by the name of Joanne Belknap, who says, first of all, I'm an ethnic fraud. As a white woman, of course, she would be the one positioned to determine the ethnicity of others and to enter into their internal politics to make the decision as to who's right and who's wrong and all the rest of that. But the fact that I will defend my rights and defend my positions and not allow orthodoxy to dictate the terms of reality to the general population unchallenged is a disservice to ethnic studies, that I must have no concern for my discipline or my department or my colleagues by virtue of not caving in to this kind of racist pressure. And spoken as a woman who almost single-handedly gutted women's studies before going back to sociology, I find that rather offensive and think that perhaps people who actually are feminists should too. Okay? A title, a label, whether it's racial, ethnic, or political, is fulfilled by the actualization on the ground in the world in practice, not by rhetoric and not by compromise with some oppressor's agenda. And frankly, she has declared herself flat out aligned with Bill O'Reilly, Sean Hannity, Lynn Cheney, David Horowitz. Enjoy your exposure, lady, because you had nothing to say to me, but you said a whole lot about yourself in a very public way.
Looks like we have some calls for Ward Churchill. This is Deborah from Denver. Deborah, you're on the air.
Hi, this is Deb Taylor. And Ward, I'm on your side, and I've been defending you against various other friends since it all first came out, and I've been fired from jobs also for not following the party line and getting disconnected from the administration. It just sounds to me that, well, a couple things. I have some friends who know you personally and you know, have reported to me that you're difficult emotionally and socially. I mean, in terms of one of your ex-wives is become an expert in dealing with battered women, partly because of being related to you, and none of that has nothing to do with your positions politically. But when I'm hearing you on the radio this morning, I'm hearing this sense of you're a victim of this right wing and institution, and I understand all that. I do. I get it. At the same time, I think that there's a certain emotional level of responsibility to other people. It's that I don't hear from you. I don't hear anything like, well, I've been unwilling to play the game, which would be more honest. And I sometimes turn people off because whatever. I mean, I just don't hear any of the emotional sense of. I mean, it's all political, and I've been a radical for years and years, and I'm trying to look at how I can be more effective and have a more positive impact on other people, and my impact is partly based on how I'm being with other people. If I'm being respectful, compassionate, even if people disagree with me.
Deb, I think we get the drift of your question.
You.
Let's give Ward Churchill a chance to respond. Thanks for calling.
Well, I'm not sure I did get the drift of that. I'm not sure that I heard anything comprehensible in there. I didn't come here to be emotional and talk about interpersonal relations, and you want to go into ex-wives, okay, he said, she said, or whatever. Nothing has to do with nothing as far as I'm concerned. I'm dealing with constructions of genocidal policy, violations of international law, dying children, and so forth, and I'm really sorry if that doesn't leave me feeling all touchy-feely for the edification of somebody I've never met.
This is Dan in Boulder. Dan, you're on KGNU.
Hi, good morning. Good being on. Mr. Churchill, I heard you, I was in Hawaii when this first broke out, and you spoke at the University of Hawaii. You were introduced by ethnic studies folks there as, highly qualified, a person who understood what had happened to the Hawaiian indigenous people, of course. And you had quite a standing ovation at the end of your talk. And my question is, though, that we hear a lot, even today a little bit, but also in the paper, that you were found guilty of these charges of X, Y, and Z, but X, Y, and Z is never spelled out. Is there a website, or can you give us a little bit exactly what you were found guilty of and why you feel that is not in any sense germane to the situation at hand, rather than just sort of like academic misconduct guilty? Well, I don't know what that means, even though I taught at universities and colleges for many years. So perhaps you can amplify on one or two specific charges that they've made and substantiated according to them. Thanks.
Okay, I'll try, although I, in all honesty, have to admit I'm not quite sure what it was that I was convicted of. I was charged with fraud, with regard to saying that the United States Army had handed out smallpox-infected blankets to Indians of Fort Clark, which is a term which covers Forts Clark Pier in Union in terms of a single phenomena. It's kind of a shorthand. And a vaccine had been withheld, also by the Army. Turns out that the vaccine was withheld by the War Department, certainly. Whether the proximate agency was the Army, and how you go about defining the Army in this interpenetrating permeable membrane of service that's set out in the northern Missouri region during this period, where they're bringing people from American fur as conscripts to serve as troops and using Indians as auxiliaries in who's what exactly. Fraud would mean that I said this not believing it to be true or not having reason to believe it to be true. And they actually, if you look at the 44 pages they devoted to the 2 or 3 paragraphs I had in a half a dozen different essays, same paragraphs essentially each time, they conclude that indeed I did have reason to believe, but I didn't tell them about it until after I'd already published the book. I'm somehow or another ex post facto supposed to have done annotation to some set of standards that's never articulated to let them in on it. Since I hadn't done that, I, in the face of Indian after Indian coming into the committee and telling them, yeah, we believe this is true, they decided that all that represented was my disrespect of Native culture. An entirely non-Indian panel has the audacity to overrule the Indians on this and conclude that I'm the one disrespectful of Native culture. And that was a fudge on the issue. What they did with the 44 pages was try to redo the Scopes monkey trial. They're trying to apprehend what's true. What's true is irrelevant to a fraud charge. What's believed to be true and why is what's relevant. They didn't address that issue. So they say, I fabricated an historical incident, and on the basis that I just described, that comes down to a form of Holocaust denial, and that was the whole point of what I was talking about in the first place. David Barsamian here just mentioned being of Armenian descent, and that he lost 3 out of 4 grandparents to the Turks in 1915 through 18 during that period. But that Holocaust didn't happen. That's the official position of Turkey. It never occurred. Well, there were some unfortunate events. This and that happened. Vacuously, you can't attach it to anything concrete. And that's exactly the game that was played by this committee. It's okay to say that the Army destroyed a lot of Indians by handing out smallpox blankets, so long as you leave it vague and innocuous like that. It's perfectly permissible to say that, but as soon as you tie it to something concrete, they're going to deny it. This was a whole exercise in denial of exactly the same sort, albeit somewhat more elegantly and in an utter sense, cumbersomely framed, the same sort of thing you could expect from a neo-Nazi Holocaust denier. And then their other big one was that I ghost wrote pieces for other people and then cited those as authorities. And they say I'm creating this hoax, this appearance of independent third-party confirmation of my point. Well, actually, there is independent third-party confirmation by virtue of the people who I ghost wrote for endorsing the piece and putting their name on it. They agree with it. That's a third-party confirmation. What would be creating the illusion would be if I just used a pseudonym and then cited to myself. That really would be to myself. That would be creating the hoax. I gave them examples, C.L.R. James, Murray Bookchin, any number of people in perfectly good standing in academy have made a practice of the latter, not the former. This is kind of unique. Usually it's junior faculty members and graduate students being imposed upon by senior professors to do their writing for them. I'm the senior party. Okay, I pass along some material to other people. That's not particularly normal, but it certainly isn't creating the illusion of third-party confirmation. So when you do, it's okay. When you create that illusion by using a pseudonym, that's kind of okay. But when you actually have third-party confirmation, that's academic misconduct. It's just absolutely absurd. And the final thing is the supposed plagiarism of a 1972 pamphlet from an organization called Damn the Dams that gave me permission to do it. We have a glitch with one of the publishers, okay. Nonetheless, a representative of the organization said, I'm glad I did it. But that's plagiarism. How exactly it comes out plagiarism, I'm not quite sure. And then the Faye Cohen case where she never did say, nor did the investigators at Dalhousie University ever say that I plagiarized anything. It's said by the preponderance of the evidence, the committee had concluded that I had plagiarized that piece, but I don't know what a preponderance of no evidence at all would be. Do you?
You're listening to Ward Churchill on KGNU Boulder 88.5 FM, KGNU Denver 1390 AM, at KGNU.org. It's 5 minutes past 9 on this Monday morning. You can call in to talk to Ward Churchill on our studio line 303-442-4242. That's 303-442-4242. Let me ask you about Yuri Kochiyama, who I could tell from her name is of Japanese origin, and you dedicate your book on the justice of roosting chickens to her. Now, she was very closely associated with the Black Panthers, Malcolm X. Isn't it possible that someone of non-African American extraction can closely identify with the culture and politics of another ethnic or religious group and be considered part of that group?
Sure. Happens all the time. And on the other hand, you can be, we're going back to the blood thing now. You can be blood with Indians, for example. You can look like you're just stepped off the nickel. You can look like Sitting Bull himself and be so white mentally, and that's a byproduct in part of the residential or boarding schooling, the indoctrination of Indian children that occurred over a century's period of time. That's another story, okay? It's how you raised, how you see the world, how you act in the world is what makes you who you are. All right? So it's not a genetic formula. That's a eugenics proposition. That's a Nazi proposition, if you will. Although eugenics was pioneered here and still very much practiced here, the Nazis picked it up and used it as is well known. South Africans have used it. Other racist entities, both socially and governmentally through laws, have defined people's identity that way. That's not a traditional native way of doing it. It's not a tradition among any people I know of other than those who have come into this sort of construction of white supremacism that has arisen over the last few hundred years, maybe 3, okay? And that knows no skin tone either. The whitest person I know is Condoleezza Rice.
Got 2 calls, Grant from Chicago, Mike from Denver. Mike from Denver, you're on KGNU.
I liked Professor Churchill's last comment on Condoleezza Rice. I would have to second that. I just wanted to make a comment here. I actually had the pleasure of meeting you. You wouldn't remember me at a lecture that you gave quite before this controversy came about at the University of Denver, or at Colorado at Denver, in the Tivoli, I believe it was. And anyway, you're most definitely a powerful personality and are bound to have made enemies. My question was, I took the time to read that essay after this controversy. And
congratulations, thank you. You're a unique individual.
I figured most people that had commented on it hadn't taken the time. And, I saw that little short snippet on Little Eichmann's, and I thought, so this is what it's all about, huh? This one little phrase, made the wrong phrase. But you must have made some enemies in high places, and I was wondering, and my question is do you have any idea who you really pissed off badly enough to go after you on this? Because that what was in that essay is not sufficient for this to evolve. So that's my point, and I'll get off the line now.
Okay, well, I was trying to sketch out what I thought the actual interests and agendas were in a broad sense, I think, in response to David's question a while ago. And so that turns this into a pretext. On the other hand, there is an emotional thing. Americans exempt themselves from any kind of responsibility for the way they conduct themselves in the world. They're very sanctimonious and judgmental about other people doing these things, but when they do it, they are inherently innocent. And you'll recall that on 9/11, by, I think, 1 p.m. Eastern time, they'd coined a whole new word, which was innocent Americans. You don't have a space between those. Innocent Americans, by virtue of being American, no matter what you've done, you're by definition innocent. And that's the sort of radical innocence that's imbued American exceptionalism all along. And what I did there was basically call them out. You're going to have to accept your responsibility and alter the realities that generate these responses, or the responses are going to be what you've elicited by the way you comport yourself both in terms of conduct, in terms of priorities, and in terms of values in the world. When you devaluate 500,000 Iraqi children to the point of inconsequence, not worthy of discussion or any kind of dissonance, cognitively or demonstratively in society, you are on exactly the same functional footing that Hannah Arendt was talking about, was occupied by Adolf Eichmann. Of course, I miscalculated there. I figured the average American might have some clue who Eichmann actually was and what it was that he did. Wrong. Bill O'Reilly hadn't sound bit that one for them lately, and so no one was aware. And so I'm comparing these people who are financial technicians to somebody who's running Jews into the gas chamber. No, Eichmann never killed a soul. He was a bureaucrat, a logistician. He arranged train schedules. He made the process possible by technical proficiency that he applied in full knowledge of the consequent and carnage to others. Okay, for his own purposes, because it was what the system required of him to get ahead, to have status, to all of those things. The banality of evil is what Arendt called Eichmann. That's what I was on about. Not that he was some stormtrooper in jackboots who was torturing people, literally. That's the point, and that's the problem. What it is that was happening in Iraq, what it has happened throughout American history, cannot happen absent the support of people who don't perform the proximate acts of carnage, that do not participate directly in the process of genocide, to create the infrastructure and the attitude that makes sure it will happen. You're culpable, you're responsible, and if you don't like it, change it. There's your national security. That's how you prevent terrorism. A law professor in Atlanta, when I was down there, which is about the time I was living there when 9/11 happened, was on the radio and said the most striking thing I ever heard. How do you prevent terrorism? Was the question. Her response was, stop killing their babies. Real simple. That was the thrust of the message. But it didn't reconcile to a populace that will respond to absolute nonsense like they're evil. They hate our freedom. Because they hate our freedom, they're evil, and we're going to kill them to make them free. And if you respond to that, and you act upon that, and you pile up bodies as a result of that, hey, turnabout is fair play.
You can read about the Eichmann trial and Hannah Arendt's analysis of it and of Eichmann himself in a book called Eichmann in Jerusalem. And I recall at the time what a furor Arendt's book caused in the establishment here, because that wasn't the picture that was desired. They wanted to have this hideous monster with fangs coming out of his head and, drooling blood. And he was a simple bureaucrat. And she pointed out that could have been any of us under the same circumstances acting in that kind of way.
That was the real horror.
That's the banality of evil. Let's go.
She put it later that she had gone expecting a monster and encountered a mouse.
Let's hear from Ash in Boulder. Ash, you're on with Ward Churchill.
Good morning, Ward.
Morning.
My question was about the whole evolution of violence, that in the beginning of time we had tribes, and we would hate someone who looked very similar to us but lived nearby. And
is that what we did at the beginning of time? I wasn't around. How would you know this?
Well, we've evolved to hating people in other valleys and other states.
But how exactly do you know how this evolution has occurred and what was going on at the beginning of time? And all of this is sort of germane to your understanding of the phenomenon. And it seems kind of like you just make this wild assumption and then proceed from there to arrive at a conclusion that we're either going to argue or I'm supposed to agree with, because you're right.
Well, let me finish my point, and then we can discuss it more in depth. And how in World War II, the nation-state got large enough to really battle with other nation-states in continents.
What was World War I about?
That was similar as well. Well, it was still located to a European continent. World War II went around the world, where we were able to hate someone who looked very different from us. Japanese versus Americans, or Chinese versus Americans. Someone who looks very, very different. And I'm wondering what is the next level of violence we're going to approach, where we obviously can't hate people on other planets, where is this going to end up? We are now all going to have to get along on this planet, or there's going to be some serious problems.
Well, ultimately, you may be right, okay, in some cosmic sense that I can't go to. This is kind of out there on the other end of the spectrum, the way your assertion of how it was at the beginning of time, okay? But how they're going to do it now is put you in line. So you're free to feel platitudes like that. We all got to get along, sort of like Rodney King, or you can recognize that there are structural factors that are in place that make these things happen and that shape consciousness to go exactly the opposite direction of what you're talking about. And you're going to have to do what's necessary to eliminate those structures and to transform, not just galvanize, but transform consciousness in the process. And I know that probably sounds kind of cosmic too, but you actually got to engage, not just feel good about other people and say we all got to get along, okay? Because there's people whose consciousness is a little different than yours and who are paid to act that consciousness out at your expense to make sure that however you feel about it, you'll do what you're told, and that's exactly what you're free to do in this country, is exactly what you're told all the time.
Thanks for your call. Let's move on.
This is Tom in Boulder. Tom, you're on the air.
Hi. Anyhow, it's a pleasure to get a chance to talk to you, Professor Churchill.
Fine. Good to hear your voice.
I just I think one of the biggest points that I haven't heard anyone talking about in this entire dialogue of all these, about the firestorm you've started, is the fact that I believe you've reached the highest calling of a professor. I mean, you've moved beyond the classrooms to where you've got people all across the country, if not the world, thinking about things that maybe people haven't wanted to address. I mean, the day 9/11 happened, I went, well, we're certainly going to go to war here, but are we going to sit back and introspect and question what it is on the part of the American people that has caused such hatred against us and caused this kind of action? And I think you've really brought that to the forefront of the dialogue, and I think it's something that needs to be addressed. And we don't, nobody wants to look at our actions and question whether or not they've been correct or whether we've, brought something on ourselves. And I commend you.
Well, thank you. And you actually got the point of what the exercise was and what education's about. I do not flatter myself to think that I have managed to accomplish at quite a level you seem to frame it there, but to the extent that I've gone part of the way, then it was exactly what I was trying to do. Thanks for acknowledging that.
Oh, thank you. And you got the ball rolling, and it's fantastic. And, whether the people agree with you or not, you've done what you're supposed to do. And I can't believe that because of this, you may lose, your position at the university. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, when it does, you'll understand the university.
Yeah, well,
okay.
I'm scared to actually do a little bit. I understand why they're doing it. It just is sad. But anyhow, thanks very much.
You're welcome.
On the justice of roosting chickens, I think you echo the remark that Malcolm X made in November 1963, shortly after the assassination of President Kennedy. And for those remarks, Malcolm X was also reprimanded by Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, but he wasn't applauding Kennedy's assassination. He was just pointing out that the U.S. government, the Kennedy administration, just 3 weeks before, was implicated in the coup in Saigon, leading to the murder of Ngo Dinh Diem and his brother-in-law and his brother and his sister, as well as terrorist attacks and invasions of Cuba, bombing of Laos, use of chemical warfare in Indochina.
Well, yeah, that's the irony of the whole thing, is that I quoted Donald Rumsfeld and Norman Schwarzkopf primarily with regard to collateral damage and legitimacy of military targets. I took Pentagon rules and applied them to the U.S. context. And there's been this unholy howl ever since about how I unfairly said this was a legitimate military target. I didn't say that. I quoted Donald Rumsfeld and the Pentagon to say that. If anybody had ever bothered to ask me whether I thought the Twin Towers were actually a legitimate military target, I would tell them straight up, no. That the Pentagon does, and you don't have a complaint with that. And it's no more or less a legitimate military target than the targets in Baghdad. And if you don't want those rules to be applied to you, stop embracing their application to other people. It's back to stop killing their babies. But so long as they're going to endorse in these circles the idea that the United States has a right and that there's some sort of a non-existent legal justification for projecting out into the world exactly that kind of behavior on a continuous basis, then there can be no complaint when it comes back. Chickens coming home to roost. See it clearly. That's that little principle of equity. All right? If it's appropriate there, then it's appropriate here. I believe it's inappropriate there. It would be, following logically, equally inappropriate here. But if you weren't doing it there, it wouldn't have happened here. It's just as simple as that. And been doing it here on this kind of spurious reasoning and self-entitlement for the duration of the history of the country. And the capacity of other people to visit consequences on that, whether you like it or not, is growing daily. And they're not going to sit by while you immiserate the lives of their populations and starve their children in order to have new cell phones and perfect cappuccinos in perpetuity. Framed in that way, they have not only the right but the obligation to visit in kind the sort of carnage that is being routinely dispensed out there in the world by the self-anointedly innocent citizenry of the United States. But the self-anointedly innocent citizenry can get that message, and then that citizenry has to be quelled by the government, by the status quo, increasingly in the same terms that are imposed upon those others. And that's sort of tied back to the last questioner. That's the direction it's going. You are the target, man. They're not doing tweezer impoundments and taking away your Bic lighter at the airport in order to stop actual terrorists. They're regimenting you. They're not doing gated communities in Brentwood in order to keep Osama bin Laden out of their bedrooms. Those are to keep wogs and riffraff from cluttering up the landscape, okay? When they talk about our security, the question is who is the we that composes the our the security is for and who they're being secured from. And it's not Al-Qaeda. It's you.
The references to the hundreds of thousands of children that were made earlier, for those listeners who are not familiar with that background, during the sanctions imposed on Iraq from August 1990 right through 2003, approximately 1 million Iraqis died as a result of dehydration, lack of potable water, lack of food, etc. Madeleine Albright on 60 Minutes was asked by Leslie Stahl if she thought the price was worth it, the price of 500,000 children dying. And the then ambassador to the United Nations, later to be Secretary of State, said that the price was worth it. That does register outside the United States. Maybe it didn't have a particular echo here, but when I travel in the Middle East, and I've been there several times recently, people are very much aware of the historical record.
Oh, yes, they are. And what words mean and how these dynamics function. Much more sophisticated. You can go into a grade school in a lot of countries and get a more knowledgeable take on how the world works than you can in an elite institution with undergraduates in the United States, at least for during their first 2 years. Unfortunately, often they're graduating with a less astute understanding of the world than an eighth grader in France or Iraq. All right? It registers. It's going to have to register here. And it's not going to be registered here through the same sanitized and diplomatic discourse that's prevailed while they continue to engage in Holocaustal activities. You're free to debate it. Yeah, to a certain extent I am, but although the present situation indicates a little bit of a converse on that, wouldn't you say? I'm not as free to debate as you'd like to pretend when the debate gets serious. But the point is, the debate's a diversion from the fact that the debating partners here are actually committing what it is that's being debated is wrong. They're committing genocide while we debate the propriety of genocide. Not exactly acceptable. The object, the obligation, ethically, morally, in terms of decency, is to stop the genocide. And you don't do that politely. Sorry. It's not an abstraction for the people on the receiving end of this. To a previous caller also, anger is an emotion, and it's one maybe you need to get in touch with.
Got a call. This is Brenda. Brenda, you're on the air with Ward Churchill.
Hi, Ward.
Hi, Brenda.
I remember in your rebuttal that you mentioned something about the university not. I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact wording, but how you were being subjected to measures that other faculty are not subjected to. And I wonder what you think about the fact that, or the possibility, actually, that the university should actually be doing the same thing to a cross-section of professors, for there to be some kind of standard. They're setting you up against a standard that really is kind of ambiguous and kind of really not established. I mean, if they did the same investigation with a representative sampling of professors across the 3 campuses, then they would have a standard. What do you think?
That would perhaps be true, but one will note there's a little caveat in a footnote in the 124-page report. See, we started out, because it's the essence of due process, asking what the standards were of it was being assessed by, and they looked all bewildered and said, we don't know ourselves. We'll figure it out at some point. Well, I'm still waiting for them to say, because what it says is the AHA standards in conjunction with others. What exactly is others in this meticulously researched report? They can't even say what standards were applied. But you can, by implication, understand those by the way they constructed the report. So what you're asking as a question is going to be clarified fairly soon, Brenda, because I'm filing on Wednesday a report on a very senior, very prominent.
Well, I'm reminded of...
Hear me out here.
Oh, sure.
I'm filing a complaint on a very senior, very prominent CU faculty member, one of their stars, on exactly the same grounds. Documented chapter and verse. And we'll see how they deal with that. They say this is not situational, it's not selective, it's consistent with something, but they can't say what it's consistent with. Well, okay, point by point, chapter and verse, here's this guy doing exactly the same thing. Now, you going to run him through the same ringer you did to me? We'll see.
Who's that?
I won't give the name yet. It would be violation of a confidential personnel process, and unlike the University of Colorado, I do not hold press conferences in order to maintain confidentiality. I simply say I'm making the complaint.
Well, I'm also reminded of Ramon Gutierrez, this when Jesus came, the Corn Mothers went away, where he makes a big case about the bleeding for power, without going into detail, where he uses all the sources from Mexico to support his claim, and yet he got a MacArthur Fellowship for that book. I mean, it just, there has to be a larger sense of what faculty do, it seems to me, before they can nail you.
Well, there's a lot of things that would be necessary in order to have the playing field that they purport to be occupying and, quote, nailing me. The thing is, they ultimately can't nail me. Okay?
Good.
I drove that picket pin in back on February 8, 2005. I'm not backing up an inch. And they want to keep coming. Well, keep coming. Like I say, you're digging the hole deeper and deeper and deeper. And all these things that you commit in concrete form to writing and in your effort to do what you're doing with me are going to be used against you. Trust me. And middle-of-the-road faculty think you can run for your bunker and be okay in the midst of all this, you might just be up on these charges. That was a point that was being made a year ago.
Right.
All right?
Well, just to echo the professor who said that I'm really glad you brought out the dirty linen in this country that people refuse to look at.
Well, it's the only way it's going to get washed, huh?
I hope so.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much for your call. We've been talking with Ward Churchill this morning on KGNU Boulder, KGNU Denver. He's a professor of American Indian Studies at the University of Colorado at Boulder. His forthcoming book, published by AK Press, is entitled Speaking Truth in the Teeth of Power, Lectures on Globalization, Colonialism, and Native North America. And his previous book with AK Press is on the justice of roosting chickens. If you'd like to read the complete essay, Ghosts of 911, Reflections on History, Justice, and Roosting Chickens, it is in this book copiously annotated and documented. There are 179 footnotes to the Ghosts of 911 essay, so you can check it out for yourself, as they say. See if it aligns with your thinking and the evidence on various information and opinions that are brought forth in this essay. Thanks very much for your time, Ward Churchill.
Thanks for having me on.
I'm David Barsamian. Thanks a lot, Sam, for hosting us here.